Cool. Okay, so welcome everybody to today's Climate Reckonings Climate Justice event. It's co-sponsored by Biology and Environmental Studies. So as most of you know, I'm Tim Parker. I'm a professor of Biology and Environmental Studies. I am the moderator of this panel discussion. The panel discussion is titled Understanding Changing Marine Ecosystems, How Do We Get the Science Right? And we have three great panelists with us today for this. The first panelist I'm mentioning these people in no particular order. The first panelist is Cascade Sorti. Cascade is an associate professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at UC Irvine. And she is a Whitman alumna. She's a biology grad from the class of 1999. She's an accomplished marine ecologist with expertise in the effects of global environmental change in marine ecosystems. I'm very happy that Cascade agreed to join us today. Next speaker is Dom Roche. Dom is a Marie Curie Fellow at Carleton University in Canada and at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. Dom is a founding member and a member of the board of directors of the Society for Open, Reliable, and Transparent Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. He has a long-standing interest in improving the reliability of ecological research, and most of his research is on fish. The third panelist is Alexa Fredston. Alexa is a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers University. And Alexa also just a few weeks ago was elected to the board of directors of the Society for Open, Reliable, and Transparent Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So we have two board members here in this panel. Alexa is a quantitative marine ecologist with a commitment to improving the reliability of science by developing reproducible workflows and open code. And I'm going to slide on over here to my computer, I think, while I moderate this. What's going to happen is I'm going to ask the speakers questions, and they're going to respond to my questions, and they might respond to each other, and we'll do that for however sort of long it goes, maybe half an hour, maybe 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from you all. Okay, so I'm going to slide over here and I think change my microphone. You guys at home, these panelists, do you hear me pretty well still? You're good? Okay. Okay, so the first question I'm going to ask, I'm asking of all three panelists, is just to describe your research. Alexa, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks so much. I am generally interested in ecosystems and biodiversity, how they work, how humans affect them, and what we can do about it. I've been particularly focused on why species are found where they are and not elsewhere, and what makes them move. This field is known as biogeography, which some of you probably know of. It's the geography of living things. And I've been studying those processes at very large spatial scales using data sets collected over long time periods and computational tools to look for big picture patterns in how species are responding to global change.
Cool. Cascade.
Hi, so I'm a marine integrative global change ecologist. So let me break that down a little bit. I specifically study global change. I'm really especially interested in the effects of climate change and invasive species. And I also call myself an integrative ecologist. And what that means is that I'm integrating across scales. So I usually start my studies at the organismal level, thinking about effects of global change on physiology. And then I scale that up to effects on populations and communities and ecosystems and up through biogeography. So Alexa and I actually met each other initially at some meetings where we were looking at effects of climate change on species ranges. And some of the main work that I've done, and it started out when I was a PhD student, was looking at how climate change can increase the impacts of invasive species.
Cool. Dom.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My background is, I guess I'm a little bit of the odd one out here. I am an ecologist. My background is in animal behavior and ecophysiology. And I've done a lot of work on coral reef fish, actually, and looking at how environmental stressors influence their movement behavior and their performance. I was very interested in swimming performance and how that's influenced by things like wave energy and temperature. And then my career took a little bit of a turn towards the end of my PhD. I started becoming really interested in the way that we carry out research. So now I guess I call myself a meta scientist or a meta researcher. So I do research on the process of doing research. And I'm particularly interested in transparency and reproducibility. And the focus of my work now is looking at open data. So the practice of sharing research data amongst researchers and with members of the public also. How, especially I'm interested in looking at how good we are as researchers in ecology and evolution at doing that. What's the quality of the research that we're sharing and what's it reused for?
Cool, thanks, Dom. I want to just pause here really quickly and ask, is everybody hearing out of the speaker well enough? Is that the speaker volume's good? Okay, great. Okay, next question on my list here for the panelists is one, maybe one panelist wants to take this. The question is, why is studying marine responses to climate change and rising carbon dioxide important? I'm going to give this to Cascade. I think she's probably very well suited to answer this question.
We were all looking at each other. I don't know if you could tell that, even though it was virtual.
I was going to vote for you too, Cascade.
Yeah.
Or Alexa.
Well, yeah. I mean, I hope we don't have to do too much convincing, but I hope that it's generally recognized that we all depend on the ocean. We all depend on marine ecosystems. Even if we're somewhat landlocked in Walla Walla, which isn't really as landlocked as a lot of landlocked places, you know, a lot of the air that we breathe has gone through oceanic critters, and you know, a lot of food that we eat comes from the ocean. And even though we know that a lot of ocean systems are really resistant and resilient to changes in the environment, we also know that all biological processes are affected by environmental conditions. So when we change the temperature, when we change the CO2 levels, that's having impacts from the very center of these marine organisms beings. And then that is, you know, basically cascading out, I could say, to different levels of biological organization. And, you know, with the unprecedented changes that we're seeing right now in the climate, we don't really have a precedent for knowing what that's going to do. And so there are certainly thresholds that we have hit where we've seen mass mortalities. There are thresholds that are coming. And so the hope is that we would understand and be able to perhaps avoid catastrophe, if at all possible.
Does anybody else want to add anything to that, Dom or Alexa, or are you good with that?
I see Alexa nodding. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this question. I think that, you know, Cascade made some excellent points there. I mean, we want to study marine systems to understand how they're going to respond to a changing climate. We also want to understand, you know, which ecosystems or species or populations are going to be the most resilient or the most susceptible to impacts from climate change, so that we can protect them. And I guess I work in a group now that's very much focused on applied science. I used to come from more of a fundamental background. And the research that people do now in this group is more oriented towards kind of environmental management and conservation. And I think they've made me realize the importance also of, you know, studying marine systems and terrestrial systems, but marine systems in particular and aquatic systems, in terms of the effectiveness of the mitigation measures that we want to implement to try and decrease the impacts of climate change or preserve the species that, you know, are going to be affected. There was a study by someone in that group, Rachel Buxton, she's a prof now actually at Carleton, just last year, showing that I think about 50% of the budgets for threatened species recovery plans are allocated towards research and monitoring. So it's a lot of money. These are species that we've identified as being threatened, and we're putting a lot of money towards actually monitoring them some more to see how they're going to be affected. But one potential consequence might be that we monitor them to extinction. And so another really important area of research is to invest some of that money towards seeing, well, what types of actions can we put to protect their habitats, protect them, and determine which ones are the most effective.
Okay, thanks. So next question is for anyone, and maybe for all three of you. What are some results about marine systems response to climate change that you're particularly confident in? So what are some things you feel like you really know about how marine systems are responding to climate change?
I'll name one, which won't surprise some of you. Species are on the move. This is a phenomenon that we're very confident in, that we've documented for over 30 years in some cases. What I mean by species are on the move is that species around the globe are shifting upwards on land and elevation, deeper into the oceans, and generally towards the poles to maintain the same climatic conditions that they evolved in for many, many years as the planet warms. There have been a lot of small differences in how species have responded to warming. Some have shifted more, some haven't shifted at all, but the overall trend is really, really clear.
Cascade, is there any result you want to call attention to?
I guess I would say that some of the results I'm really confident in are results that I could see with my naked eye. And some people have called ecology the rigorous proof of the obvious. And I think a lot of us have seen effects of global change, of climate change. And a lot of what ecology is doing is documenting that and, quantifying it to make sure that it's not just a one-off observation and that we have, real documentation of it. But, we've seen mass mortality events. We've seen that mortality events are becoming more frequent as heat waves become more frequent. One of the experiments that my group did, which has involved a couple of Whitman students, Grant Gallagher and Leah Samuels, who have come out to Alaska to work with us, has simulated climate change in tide pools. And we see that the tide pools that get the hottest have the highest mortality. And so we're seeing that if we increase temperature in tide pools by just 2 degrees Celsius, that it pushes species past their thresholds. So I think something I'm really confident in is the fact that we are reaching those thresholds for species, the thresholds that lead to mortality.
So my next question is, do you think that most science on marine responses to climate change is reliable? Dom, what do you say?
I shouldn't be the first one to respond to this. I just wanted to quickly add to your previous question. Also, I put that question to some colleagues of mine who I work with really closely. They're hardcore physiologists, much more so than I am, and I was curious to see, they work on marine systems, and they're all a bit shocked by the question and started scratching their heads to figure out, what are the results that we're really confident about? And I think that, the one that Alexa mentioned, I saw Cascade nodding her head as well, that, species are on the move. Everyone agrees about that. They said that is, there's no discussion about it. Cascade's mentioned seeing it with our own eyes. I went diving in Gaspésie, which is a part of kind of northern Quebec, this summer, and the lobster population there is exploding because they're moving from Maine in the US towards Quebec, actually. So the lobster fishermen are really happy. I had heard about that, but to see it with your own eyes also is something quite different. In terms of the physiological processes, I think people agree on these types of patterns. Physiologists know that things are happening. For example, we see that fish are shrinking or not growing as big when temperatures warm. But the physiological mechanisms to explain these differences are hotly debated still. We don't really agree on the mechanisms. So I think the patterns, people are pretty confident in many of the patterns, but less so in some of these mechanisms. Leading to this question, do you think most science on marine responses to climate change is reliable? I think that yes, there's a lot of science that is highly reliable. But I think that in my field, when it comes to these uncovering these particular mechanisms, some people tend to have their kind of pet hypotheses, and they come up with very sexy hypotheses, and they defend them very strongly. But it's pretty clear from the literature and empirical evidence that it's not as clear cut. There is debate on what these mechanisms are, and I think I'll leave it to that for now.
I'll speak a little bit to the reliability question from the perspective of the type of work I do, which is really strictly computational, either analyzing big data sets or simulating and modeling stuff. So in that sense, reliability has less to do with like conducting an experiment correctly and reporting the results accurately, and more to do with whether you literally wrote the code correctly and then whether you reported it transparently. I think it is the case that overwhelmingly most computational global change marine science is reliable, but I do think it's important to understand that it's reliably doing exactly what it's doing. It can be a little hard to figure out what that is. One great example is that a lot of people look at how different environmental variables affect marine systems in these large scale analyses, but often in summarizing their research, people will say, we looked at the effect of climate. There are an infinite number of ways you can measure climate, and the one that they picked might really matter. So that doesn't mean their research isn't reliable. It does mean that they might have gotten a different result if they looked at, for example, changing species distributions in relation to mean temperature or temperature extremes, or temperature at the bottom of the ocean or at the surface of the ocean, or temperature and salinity or temperature and pH. So I think, at least in kind of computational global change biology, I overwhelmingly think the field is very reliable, but I think it's important to have a high level of literacy so that you can parse what actually happened in these really complex analyses.
I'll just add to what Alexa said. I'm really glad you brought that up about the fact that there's a lot of analysis that's kind of behind the scenes to some of the data that gets published. And I think one thing that's been challenging for me is that when I was being trained in ecology, we were still doing ANOVA and ANCOVA, and mixed models were a really new thing. And for those of you that might be going on to do scientific research, the kinds of statistics that you're likely to be studying are a lot more complex than the statistics that I was studying and using. And so I tend to be more convinced and feel that data are more reliable when you don't have to have some really complex statistics to show you, to answer a question for you, if that makes sense. It again comes back to the fact that if someone can make a simple figure and show the data really clearly, and I can see the pattern, the clearest type of pattern would be 2 bars, like at ambient temperature, at increased temperature, like that kind of thing is easy to evaluate. But there are a lot of analyses in the papers that are written these days that are, to me, difficult and complex to evaluate. And then the one other thing, there was one other thing I was going to say. I do think that that 99.99% of ecologists are doing their best to provide the most reliable data possible, but there are mistakes that happen, whether they're on purpose or there's something unethical going on, and so I think it's our job when we are consuming that science to be thinking critically, and hopefully that's something that you've practiced in your classes at Whitman. It's definitely something that we work with graduate students on, is like, how do you read a paper critically and evaluate the experimental design? Do you agree with it? Do you not agree with it? You get to the point in grad school where you're just shredding every paper you read because you're starting to read so critically, right? So I just think we all want to be reading critically and asking questions as we read.
Well, so for the panelists, I will just say, I think based on, because of the time, I'm going to kind of skip over some of our pre-planned questions. But what Cascade, what you were just talking about, I think leads pretty well to the question of basically how do you recognize reliable versus unreliable research? Like when you're looking through a paper, for instance, like what makes you think, oh, this is reliable, or oh, maybe I'm not so confident that this is reliable? Question for anybody.
I'm happy to jump in if you want. Actually, I wanted to add on to what Cascade said, but I can keep that for the discussion afterwards as well if we can come back to it. But I think, so what's really interesting is that there is increasingly research on that specific question, right? What are characteristics of studies that increase the likelihood of the result being correct, right? Or the result being robust? And so some important things are large sample sizes. For example, we know that if you have a large sample size, you have a greater power to detect an effect. So if there's a small effect, for example, a small difference between two groups, or a weak relationship, but still a relationship between two variables, having a large effect size means that you'll be more likely to detect it and more confident also in the magnitude of the effect that you've uncovered. There's also research showing that, in fact, when you have a heterogeneous sample, so kind of a mix, basically, something that's not too standard and not too controlled, and also methods that can be quite variable and that are conducted by large teams rather than kind of smaller and restricted teams, that tends to lead to results that are more robust to replication. So we're more likely to find the same results if we were to repeat the experiment, rather than having only a small group of researchers working on a very controlled system in a controlled environment, for example. Because as soon as the conditions change, the result probably changes as well, right? So in terms of that point, like replication, if studies have been replicated and other groups have found the same results as a study that's been published or an original study, that also tends to indicate that the results are robust and highly credible. And I guess maybe one final thing that I care a lot about is people showing what they've done, reporting things, comprehensively and transparently, and ideally, not just publishing a paper, but also sharing the data that underlie the results in the published paper. Like Alexa mentioned, sharing their code, their scripts. Analyses are really complex now, and it's easy to make mistakes. So if you share these publicly, then people can have a look at it and let you know if they found a mistake, and then we can all work towards correcting it.
Anybody want to add to that?
Comprehensive enough?
Yeah, I think you hit all the main points.
Okay. So are you aware of examples of unreliable marine environmental change science?
I can give an example of, I think, what I'm gonna call poorly communicated modeling rather than totally unreliable. A lot of the papers that I get asked to do peer reviewing for are species distribution models, which are spatial statistical models that estimate where species are found over a geography based on where we know that they were or weren't. And these are really widely used in everything from figuring out where to pay for more monitoring to projecting future distributions under climate change. And the distributions under climate change one is one of the most popular. And I reviewed a paper where like the title and all the main results and figures were saying for this particular country, here's where all the marine species will shift in 2050 and 2100 under a particular climate scenario. And I dug pretty deeply into the methods of this paper and the supplemental materials that they'd uploaded, and found that the amount of variation in the actual species distribution that was explained by their climate variables was like 0.5%, 0.5%. And they were saying based on, we explained 0.5% of the historical distribution of species, so we're projecting their future distributions based on climate change. So their model wasn't wrong. They fitted a model, it had a certain effect size and predictive ability, and then they projected it forward. But the way they told people, what they told people it said was misleading. And in the referee report that I sent back to them, I said, you can leave the model, but you can't describe it in this way because it's, I won't say unreliable, but it's misleading. And they totally rewrote the paper to say, if things were tracking temperature, which we don't think they are, here's where they would go. And maybe here are some reasons why they're not tracking temperature, which was a much more reliable way to report the results. And I think that happens quite commonly. And it's often naive. In that case, I'm almost sure it was a team of people. One person ran the models and one person wrote the paper, and they didn't fully talk about how to describe what they actually found.
I could maybe
Cascade,
talk.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Cascade.
No, you go, Dom. That's fine.
Okay, I was just going to say I can talk to another example of something that I've been very closely involved in, collaborating with these physiologists that I was talking about earlier. In my field, kind of in animal behavior, ecophysiology, marine systems, there's been a lot of research done in the last decade or so on ocean acidification and the effects that that might have on the behavior of fishes. And there's actually some really important papers that came out around 2012 or so, showing that if you subject fish to levels of ocean acidification that mimic what's going to happen at the end of the century, their behaviors are really altered to the extent that they can't recognize, or not. They can recognize them because they're attracted to the odors of their predators, which is very bizarre because we know fish can sense the odor of their predators in the water, but usually they're repelled by that because obviously they don't want to be eaten. And so these results showed that in fact they're so messed up that they become attracted to these odors, which is really maladaptive. And therefore, these papers concluded that could have really negative influences on the survival of these fish and their populations. And so these physiologists I work with were really interested in the mechanisms. Why is it that this happens? And they, collaboratively undertook a really pretty big research program to try and figure out what are the physiological mechanisms underpinning this. And lo and behold, we were completely unable to replicate these results. We never found an attraction to predator odor when we treated the same fish in the same location at the same time of the year throughout a whole bunch of species. We were never able to detect that effect. And so, we became a bit worried about that. And it so happens that, over the years, people have done similar studies on other species. And what we see is what's considered to be a decline effect, where there's a study that's published initially with very, very strong effects, and maybe something went wrong there. And then people are really interested in that. And there's publication bias that happens, or kind of people already are biased and they expect to find the same results. So the couple studies that happen afterwards might support it. But then as time goes by, more and more studies are published, and we see that this large effect that occurred initially actually doesn't happen anymore. We don't find it. And so that's kind of where we're at now. We've realized that this effect is much weaker than it was originally reported to be, or actually doesn't exist. And so the field now is undergoing a bit of a reckoning and realizing that, wow, we spent a decade looking at this question. Maybe we need to move on to something else.
Not aware of any additional examples. I just thought I'd mention that work that Dom is talking about was really widely reported to the point that I was teaching it in my marine biology classes. I remember I talked about it in a talk that I gave during one of my faculty interviews. And so, to think that that it had made it to that point of really being taught, but might not be reliable, was definitely concerning. And it has made me a lot more vigilant about cases that might be unreliable and more critical. It's just kind of been a reminder to me to be more critical in my reading. But fortunately, I'm not aware of any. I mean, the examples of unreliable science that I know of are pretty few and far between, and mostly hearsay.
I think just to add to that quick point too, that it's interesting to hear that, Cascade, you were using that because people do mention there's these textbook examples that sometimes, over time we realize, well, maybe they're not as reliable as we used to think they were. There's a couple examples in evolutionary biology, but, in this respect, I think that the key message here is that, it's not because fish behavior is not affected by acidifying oceans that climate change is not a bad thing, right? We know that there are all sorts of other effects, and it might be that ocean acidification affects other traits in fishes. It might be their physiology, it might be their development, it might be all sorts of things. And so we have to be very careful here that, if we do find that some results are maybe less reliable than we initially thought, we can't just kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it's pretty clear now that we know through other studies that have been done that temperature is really important, and probably more important than dissolved oxygen in affecting kind of the physiology and the behavior of these choroid fish that were studied in this context.
So do you think there's anything we need to be doing, anything further that we need to be doing to promote the rigor of marine science's study of marine environmental change?
I'll start on this one because prior to this panel, the four of us met and talked about this a little bit, and I was the pessimistic one in the bunch about this question, and then Dom said he would come after me and provide some optimism. But the scientific system really incentivizes fast science. It incentivizes getting the data, analyzing the data as quickly as possible, publishing the data as quickly as possible. It disincentivizes taking extra time, doing extra checks, because we're all really busy and because our success in our career is dependent on publishing. I mean, you've probably heard the term publish or perish. And another way that these checks on reliable science are not incentivized is that one of the really important checks that Alexa mentioned is the peer review process. And unfortunately, peer reviewers are not rewarded for their peer reviewing work. And so when we review a paper as a peer reviewer, so papers are submitted by the scientists, and then the papers are sent out for a couple of other, maybe 2 to 3 other scientists to review, make sure the paper looks sound and the science looks sound. Those reviewers are doing that as a service, and they're not getting paid for it. They're not really getting credit for it. It's not even really something that takes up much space on your CV. And so I think what we really need is we need ways of incentivizing slow science. We need to find ways of incentivizing peer reviewing and validating and rewarding peer reviewing, ways to make it harder for unreliable science to get through.
Alexa, did you want to jump in?
No, you go ahead. I'll end.
All right. Yes, I think those are really important points that Cascade mentions there. I can't overemphasize the effect that the current incentive structure has in academia right now. You'll ask any prof and they'll tell you, you ask them if they're busy and they'll tell you, sweat will start dripping on the side of their head because they're under so much pressure to, contribute to their university, but also, show that they're being very productive. And the way that that's done in academia is by publishing papers. So publishing lots of papers and also trying to publish them in very prestigious journals. And it's hard to publish there because these journals want really sexy results. They want clear-cut, silver bullet, we found the problem and the solution, we understand everything, and here's a neatly packaged thing that everyone can kind of understand. And it's really difficult to do that. So that's why, I guess, coming to Alexa's point earlier on, that some researchers will simplify their message and maybe not talk about some of the caveats or limitations of the work that they've done because the journals don't like that. And if you avoid mentioning that, you can get into these more prestigious journals, and that is good for your university, good for your evaluation, etc. So, what we need to do to incentivize more rigor, I think, is to put pressure on university administrators who evaluate the researchers and talk to funding agencies who support the research to try and get them to change the incentive structure. A bit like Cascade mentioned, we need to not do science really fast and sometimes a bit recklessly, because we have a lot of pressure to do that, but we need to do things in a more rigorous way, in a more transparent way, and in a more reproducible way. And so if funding agencies and universities and journals start rewarding that by saying, oh, right, well, you've shared the data that's associated with your paper, you know, you've also showed us your code and you've reported things really comprehensively, then people are going to do it because that's what they're rewarded to do. So I think it's just a matter of kind of a culture shift, and it's happening. So, you know, Cascade mentioned, I would say, positive things. There are lots of initiatives out there, that kind of grassroots initiatives to change the incentive structure in that sense. And they're having a big effect. I'm thinking primarily of like the DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment. It's a big kind of manifesto that was signed by lots of institutions and funding agencies. And we see it now that funders are asking us for that. You know, when you submit a grant application, they say, well, give us your data management plan. Tell us how you're going to share your data. How are you going to communicate this with the public as well? And those aspects of the research are also being evaluated, not just where where the paper is published and how many papers you're going to publish from this research project. So I think that's very encouraging.
In addition to all these amazing points about the practice of science, I think it's also maybe relevant to highlight a growing field of marine science, which is synthesis science. Recognizing that most results that we have on climate change or other human impacts on marine ecosystems are from one experiment or one field site or one study, and with the rise of computational capacity, there's been an enormous emphasis on synthesizing those results across the literature. Using a broad range of techniques. Sometimes you kind of pull all the results from different papers and look at how consistent they are. Sometimes you use big data sets to look for these patterns, but it has, in many cases, revealed some big picture patterns or the absence of some that people thought were there from focal studies that have, I think, provided a lot of rigor to our understanding of how general these phenomena are. As ecologists, you study one place with the hope that what you find applies elsewhere. And synthesis has revealed that sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not. A great example is that there has been a great deal of emphasis in the ecological literature on the concept of tipping points, which is when an ecosystem abruptly crosses some threshold and basically collapses into a different state from which it's very hard to recover. One of the quintessential marine examples is the transition from coral reefs to algal dominated ecosystems that are really hard to get back to being a coral reef. And someone did a huge synthesis project very recently on the search for tipping points and found that they almost never happen. They're super rare. And there are lots of papers documenting them, but if you actually look at all of our ecological historical data sets, they almost never occur. So that gives us a different perspective on how transferable the science is that I think improves rigor of the field by a lot.
Okay, I was sort of taken up listening to your example, Alexa, and I wasn't thinking about the next question. So that was interesting. Well, what about so for the three of you personally, is there anything that you have done yourself anything that you've sort of changed or plan to change with your own practices to improve rigor or in response to evidence that at least some results out there are unreliable? Alexa?
Yeah, I'll start. I've been trying really hard to put into practice all the principles that Dom just outlined about being really transparent in your computational practices. So I'm kind of militantly open about data and code. You can find all the code for all my research on GitHub. It's all there. In the past, as soon as I finished a project, I've made the code public. Other people have actually downloaded the code, strangers, made suggestions to it and sent it back to me, which has been really exciting, and have actively encouraged others in the community to go through what I've done. And it's partly because I'm terrified of the type of mistakes that Cascade mentioned that are totally unintentional. A paper was retracted recently because the authors misunderstood the way a function in the software they were using did an average. A single line of code, they didn't put in remove NA, and it could change all of their results, and they had to retract the paper. So I think that that's something that I constantly try to do, is make my work as accessible to everyone as early as possible, so that people can check what I've done and can see if it either sparks inspiration for their own work, but also if they can reproduce my results.
I've been thinking about this issue a lot from the perspective of being an advisor to graduate students, because most of the work that I do, you know, I maybe write myself one paper a year, but I have, you know, maybe 10 papers a year that I'm working on with grad students I'm advising. And in the past, I would devote maybe half a day to going through a paper or something. But I have been trying to increase the amount of time that I can spend on that, to the point of going back to the data sometimes, especially if there's something that that I question, just to make sure that I'm helping to catch any errors. And usually it's, well, it's always been completely unintentional, but usually it's just interpretation errors or how things are put. And sometimes I will go back and rerun some of the analyses. And so that's been a challenge, because it does increase the turnaround time for me, and it definitely increases the workload a lot. So I'm still trying to kind of come up with a balance for that. And one thing that I haven't reconciled is how much I need to do that with, say, papers where I'm a co-author, and where the person that's leading it is someone who's another faculty member. Do I also need to go to the data? I am responsible for that paper, but am I responsible for an analysis being correct? It can be challenging for me because, as I said, I'm not trained in some of the more complex mixed model approaches. And so I have some limitations on my statistical knowledge. And I think that's one thing that's going to be challenging for me going forward. But in general, I'm trying to take more responsibility and make sure that I'm another check in the system.
I can add maybe a slightly different perspective. I still run experiments. I mean, I work maybe once a year with some colleagues. We get together at a field station and then run experiments on fish for 3 weeks or a month. And over time, I think that as we become more aware of kind of good or better research practices, the types of research practices that lead to more robust and reproducible results, we've really made a big effort to increase our sample sizes, make sure that, say, if we're comparing two different groups, we don't have 10 or 15. And physiologists are actually really used to having small sample sizes, sometimes because you're limited by research ethics committees on how many fish you can use. Some procedures can be really invasive. But now we feel like we're more justified to say, well, we need to work on more fish because we want to make sure that we have sufficient power to report something that's robust. We've also really made a big effort to try and use methods that prevent us from introducing our own biases into the data collection. For example, if you're comparing two groups of fish, one in low temperature and one at high temperature, and you have an expectation that something's going to happen at high temperature, when you're recording your observations, for example, or making your measurements, you know what to expect, right? And so even if you're trying to be completely objective, it can be very difficult to do that. And so removing that human factor can really lead to reduced biases and more robust results. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you're doing a behavioral experiment where you're looking at the effect of temperature on fish activity, for example. Well, rather than people look at them and count the number of lines that they cross, well, you can now use video record it, and use automated tracking software to do that for you. And it's so sophisticated now. It's free, it's automated, there's tons of them out there. And you can do things like, count the number of times that a fish goes and tap on something, or like the different areas of the tank that it's in, like the distance that it covers. These software can do amazing things. And then you got data that are really unbiased at the end of it. And so I think you can be much more confident in your results.
Great. So it's 47 minutes past the hour. So I think I'm going to skip over having the three of you do closing statements, and I'm going to open up the floor to questions. If you're on the webinar, you can post your question in the Q&A. I'll keep an eye out for it, and I will. Let's see. I'm going to switch the microphone here to the room microphone.
And I'm going to open it up to questions, if anybody has questions. They're flying fast and furious here. They're fighting over it. Okay. Oh, we got one in the Q&A. Let's see. Okay. So if more and more articles are found to be unreliable as the result of pressures researchers feel to publish, do you expect a decrease in the prestige or value of being published in these journals over time? If so, are there other career goals that researchers can or should shift their focus to that they could benefit both the scientific community and showcase that work?
I'll just jump in and say yes. So there are some open access journals like PLOS One that I used to really like to publish in, but that have published some unreliable data or perhaps not well peer-reviewed data, and that has made me less likely to publish there. I also tend to prefer to publish in not-for-profit journals because for-profit journals have also an incentive to publish papers and publish them quickly. And so I prefer to publish in, say, society journals where if you're paying for page charges, it's going to the society.
I think it's a really good question. And if you look at, for example, so when we talk about these prestigious journals that people want to publish in, people often think of like Nature and Science, and those papers can essentially make your career sometimes because they're so highly valued by universities and funding institutions. And I guess the question is, can we shift away from that? And I think there is a big effort to do that within certain communities in science right now. You can think, for example, of the open science community, which is researchers from across fields that really value kind of transparency and reproducibility. And when they see kind of papers being published in these highly prestigious journals, because they're very exciting, but we realize, well, maybe they're not all that rigorous. Some papers in Nature and Science do get retracted. Then I think there's a bit of a pushback, right? And people are starting to realize, well, it's not because something is published in these journals there that it's gold. And people are trying to come up with alternatives to that. So other journals are popping up that are prioritizing other things. An example is eLife, for example. And so that's a journal that is open access. Obviously you have to pay to publish there, but at least the article that's published is available for everyone to read, which is not the case for places like Nature and Science. But they also have other measures in place. Like, so they require data to be shared so that people can inspect the data, which is not always the case for other prestigious journals. And they've implemented things like transparent peer review also, which is adds transparency, because usually when papers get peer reviewed, the readers don't get to see the comments of the reviewers and the response of the authors to those comments. Some journals have implemented that for added transparency so that you can see kind of what were the weaknesses and the strengths of a paper before it got to the final version. You can kind of follow its evolution through the peer review process. And so I think those are very positive developments. And then they benefit the scientific community in that research then is kind of more transparent, more credible, and more reusable also. By making these these materials, the code and the data available to others. It's not just to validate things, but we can also build on them. I mean, Alexa would be perfect to speak to that. She does a lot of synthesis, and a lot of that work relies on data being available and people sharing resources like code and script or software that they've written.
And I won't speak extensively to this because I see another question waiting, but I will say that now that high-profile journals require you to upload code and data, unless there is some reason why you can't upload it, like it's sensitive and about human subjects, people will rerun the analyses in those journals. And recently they have and found discrepancies and caused papers to be retracted, which is sort of embarrassing for everyone involved. So I think that that has a huge influence on how careful people are in their analyses, because if you know that people can kind of follow your soup to nuts workflow, you'll be very careful to get it right. And as Cascade said, not out of some sinister motive to hide something, but because everyone's really busy, there has not historically been an incentive to check everything 3 times before you submit a paper. And now there sort of is, which I think is great progress.
Okay, here's this next question. When doing an experiment that has already been done before and already knowing the outcome, how can you still focus your attention to try and pinpoint those inaccuracies in the methods process? How can you keep an open mind coming into one of these fixed methods while already knowing the outcome?
I can speak to that quickly. So I think it's difficult, and that's why we talk of these. People have biases. When you read a paper that's been published and it says that you observe this effect, then if you're going to do the same study on, say, or repeat the study on the same population, or even on another species or population, you're going to expect probably to find something similar. But that might not always be the case. There's all sorts of reasons why things might be different. There's a lot of variation in space and in time. There's a lot of variation among populations and also among and within individuals as well. And so I think, coming back to one of the points that Cascade mentioned, I think, we have to be critical in the work, like in reading published work. And we also have to understand that the world is very variable. And so when we go out there and conduct studies, we often build them, or they're built on previous work that's been done by other scientists. But we have to be careful not to introduce our own biases into that. And like I explained earlier, there are ways to do that, by blinding yourself when you're conducting experiments, not knowing what the treatments are. That's been proven to be very effective at removing these sources of biases.
Okay, well, it doesn't look like there are any more questions unless there are. No one's knocking me down to get more questions asked. So why don't we, at this time, I'll offer the 3 panelists an opportunity to just give a final quick closing statement before we finish. Trying to remember the order we went at the beginning. I don't know. John, why don't you go first?
Sorry, I didn't hear. That was me, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So in closing, I think that I'm really encouraged by the state of affairs right now in environmental science and in marine science also, because I think that we've really come through kind of a reckoning, which is, I think, extremely important. As scientists, we need to be introspective. We can't just keep on going and doing science and producing a lot of research without kind of stopping and saying, well, wait a second, are we going down the right path here? Are we doing things, first of all, are we doing things well? And even if we are, how can we improve on the research that we're doing? And I think that is happening right now. And I get a sense, especially from working with young researchers, I often give workshops to teach kind of reproducible research practices. So open science practices and whatnot. And I feel so much energy coming from undergraduate and graduate students who are coming to these workshops, because they're, they get into science because they're excited about science. They want to discover, the truths. They want to understand how nature works. And I think as you progress in your career, you have all these other pressures coming at you to publish in prestigious journals and whatnot. But I think it's really, these students who are coming early into these workshops understand the system better, and they understand what types of practices they can engage in to make sure that they stay true to their initial motivations for going into science. And so I think that, the future is looking really bright. I think that a lot of the young researchers that are being trained now are extremely strong in computational research. They're learning the right methods. They're learning the right statistics. They're learning to be critical. And I think they're going to make fantastic researchers in the future.
Alexa?
But don't have much to add. I completely agree with all of that, but I'll just say from a computational standpoint, I think it's also a really exciting time to be thinking about the oceans in the context of global change, because the quantitative tools are more sophisticated than ever, the data sets are bigger than ever, and everything has become really transparent. So it is a time that I expect will have enormous developments in how well we can analyze and model and forecast marine systems. Something that I've worked on a lot is how we can forecast marine ecosystems the way we forecast the weather. And weather forecasting is really transparent. You might not think it's that reliable, but you can at least quantitatively tell where the uncertainty comes from. And I think that's where at least quantitative global change science is moving towards, which is sort of a tonic for these issues around reliability and reproducibility. And I think a really exciting time.
And I just was thinking about, what kinds of advice or thoughts I might have for students like yourselves that are setting out, maybe some of you, for careers in environmental science. And I came up with 3 thoughts. So my first thought was to make sure that you're doing reliable science, surround yourself with good people, with people of high integrity, with people that recognize that mistakes happen. And although you always try to avoid mistakes, with people where you'll be able to own up to your mistakes if you need to, because I think that will save you from, perhaps creating unreliable science yourself. The second thing is to be open-minded with your data. That's come up a few times. Remember that the data are the data, and so the data are always right. Interpretations of it can be wrong, but the data themselves are right, and you can make them even more right if you avoid bias in the way they're collected. So trust the data. And then the third thing is be confident. Actually, what I see with the students that I work with is not that they are going around claiming things that they shouldn't be claiming, but more often than not, they are hesitant to really be confident in their results, because, as I said, graduate students are trained to be critical of everything they read. And so at this point, they're not really sure what they can be confident in. And, I try to tell them, be confident in your results, tell your story, but exactly what you've heard here, show your work, be transparent, provide your code, provide your data so that other people can check it along the way. So those are the 3 things: surround yourself with good people, the data are the data, and be confident.
Okay, thanks very much, Don, Cascade, and Alexa. Appreciate very much your taking the time. So.